Imagine this. It's Victorian England, ranging from the years 1837 to 1901. During the reign of Queen Victoria, you're young, just entering society, and before you even attend your first social gathering, your future's already set up for you. How you speak, how you behave, even in some cases, who you marry, and more importantly, who you're expected to become in society. Well, welcome to the Victorian Hour. I am your host, Lady Catherine. Grab a drink, grab something to eat because we're going to be here for a little while. And today, we're just not talking about romance, we're talking about rules. The expectations behind courtship and marriage, and how those expectations shape the roles of men and women in the Victorian era. Because love, love was optional, but structure, that was everything. So, this brings us to the question: how did courtship and marriage reinforce gender roles in Victorian England? So, in this episode, I explore how these systems, particularly among the middle upper classes, work to reinforce gender roles, which means like positioning men as providers and women as domestic caretakers, ultimately sustaining a patriarchal society. But we'll also look at something just as important: how some people begin to push back. So, for context, Victorian England was a society deeply concerned with respectability. With the rise of the middle class, of course, there was an increased focus on behaving properly. And nowhere was this more seen than in relationships. Relationships were everything. And how did people learn what was proper? Well, through etiquette manuals or conduct books. And these books didn't just give advice, they pretty much define how men and women were supposed to live. So let's start with courtship. Let's really get into the nitty gritty. So, courtship wasn't casual as it is today. It was more structured, more supervised, and really more intentional. So, according to some conduct writers, such as Annie S. Swan, this stage of life was where young men and women began learning the roles they would later perform in their own marriage. For men, etiquette books such as the Gentleman's Book of Etiquette made expectations very clear. A proper gentleman was expected to: one, initiate conversations, pay formal visits, demonstrate respect, restraint, and financial stability. He had to lead, but carefully. Be confident, but never improper. For women, expectations were far more restrictive. Conduct literature emphasizes the importance of modesty, self control, and reputation. A woman was expected to be attractive and agreeable, but never forward. As described in these advice literatures, the ideal young woman was someone who appeared naturally desirable without actively seeking attention. So basically, you had to be noticed, but not look like you were trying to be noticed. However, courtship itself was heavily monitored. Women were rarely alone with men, and chaperones ensured that interactions remained appropriate. Because if a woman's reputation was damaged during courtship, so was her future. So even here, we see it clearly. Courtship wasn't just about finding love, it was about training individuals to fit into these gender roles. However, if courtship was rehearsals, marriage was the performance. And this is where expectations became even more explicit. So in her writings, Annie S. Swan outlines clear ideals for both husbands and wives. In discussions of the ideal wife, she empathizes qualities like devotion to the home, emotional support for the husband, skills in managing household duties, and dedication to motherhood. So the ideal woman wasn't just a partner, she was literally the moral center of the home. But also, she was expected to be obedient and self sacrificing. Now, on the other hand, the ideal husband was described as someone who was a provider, a protector, a figure of authority. He was responsible for the family's financial stability and public reputation. So, right away, we see a clear division: men, authority; woman, care, and domestic responsibility. And it wasn't just social, it was really legal as well. So a woman's legal identity was pretty much tied to her husband. She couldn't really own property or control her own earnings until reforms like the Marriage Women's Property Act of 1870 and the Marriage Women Property Act of 1882 began to change that. But even with these laws, the expectations of behavior remained the same. Marriage didn't just reflect gender roles, it enforced them pretty much daily. So, pretty much all of this ties into one major idea: separate spheres. Men belong into the public world, which is work, politics, business, and women belonged in the private world, which was home, children, and morality. And this belief was so normalized that even Queen Victoria herself once said, in quotes, "We women, if we are to be good women, feminine and admirable, and domestic, are not fitted to reign." Which is ironic because she was reigning. She was the Queen of England. But that's exactly the point. Even the most powerful women in Britain reinforced the idea that women were meant for domestic life. Cultural ideals like the angel in the house further promote this image of women as selfless, nurturing, and devoted entirely to others. However, I do want to say that not only were women affected by this, but men were also affected by this. These expectations didn't just stop at women, they also applied to men. Historians like John Tosh showed that Victorian masculinity came with its own pressures. Men were expected to be rational, emotionally controlled, and financially successful. Etiquette manuals also reinforce this idea, emphasizing discipline and composure in both private and public life. So you really couldn't get away from these ideals. So even though men held authority, they were also expected to constantly prove themselves worthy of it. However, back when I was saying earlier about how there were some resistance during this time, and I wanted to look into literature of this time. And this is where we begin to see that shift because not everyone accepted these roles without question. In Jane Eyre, a book written by Charlotte Bronte, she creates a character who insists on her own independence and equality in love. So Jane refuses to marry under conditions that pretty much compromise her self-respect. Similarly, in North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell presents a woman engaged with the world beyond the home. You know, she's challenging the idea that women should remain public domestic. So she is stepping into the man's world. She stepped into the public life of her own. And that's really empowering and could have been very different during this time because everything was so structured. And surprisingly, beyond literature, figures like N.E.S. Swan, the woman who made the etiquette manual of the art of homemaking, the woman that I mentioned earlier, herself became involved in the women's suffrage movement later on in her life. So even though she started from the ideal husband and the ideal wife, she herself went into the women's suffrage movement. So while conduct books define the ideal, reality was starting to push back in a lot of ways, actually. However, historians today approach this topic from multiple angles. And those angles will be from Jennifer Fakeley, who wrote the book Courtship and Marriage in Victorian England. And she really do highlight how courtship in both middle and upper classes and even lower classes reinforce gender roles, but also how it has allowed for some small forms of agency. Number Scott Kahn, who focuses on the subversion of Victorian gender roles in Oscar Wilde's selected plays, which is also a primary source, she focuses on how cultural works help normalize these expectations. And together they show that Victorian society was not just restrictive, but also complex. So, what do we take from all of this? Well, we can say that courtship taught people how to behave. Marriage required people to live out these gender roles. And through etiquette books, legal systems, and cultural ideals, these expectations became very normalized. Men were expected to lead because that was all that they really knew. Women were expected to be supportive because that's all that they saw. And when it came to restrictive media that was being pushed out, like the literature books that I mentioned earlier, it was characters who weren't following the status quo, characters who didn't want to be just a part of the private sphere of their lives. And I find that very empowering because not everyone was just following blindly to these societal norms, which is also very important. And we still see, little pieces of crumbs when it comes to gender roles today. You have men who are still the providers, and you have a lot of women who do still want to stay in a home. And I feel like there's nothing wrong with that. However, I feel like now, since we have more rights to do whatever you want to do, really, is very eye-opening. So this essentially just means that the Victorian era wasn't just history. It pretty much is part of the foundation on how we understand relationships even today. And I find that very interesting. So that is the end of the episode of the Victorian Hour. I hope that I was able to teach a little something here tonight. And yeah, thank you so much. Bye.